Chapter 2. When Chesney stepped inside the door, he felt a rush of emotions that were hard to describe. He instantly felt like he was somewhere he wasn't supposed to be, but at the same time he felt like something close to an explorer. First he noticed the absolute, thunderous silence of the place. The only sounds he could hear were the pounding heartbeats in his chest, and his breathing. In the silence, every slight movement and twitch seemed to audibly groan from his body and fill the room. He became a bit unsettled. When he took a deep breath, the air didn't seem as stale as Chesney would have imagined, but it was almost completely dark. It took a few moments for his eyesight to adjust, but by the light coming from the tiniest sliver of a crack in the door behind them, he could make out some details. The walls and floor were completely different than that of the rest of the magic school buildings. They were metal, and seemed to be made up of interlocking patterns, or maybe plates. He could tell that the walls had something on them, and maybe shapes in the corners as well, but beyond that things were too dark to discern.
"I don't suppose you brought a lantern or anything?"
Duke said, quite close beside him.
"No, though I guess we should have seen that coming,"
Chesney replied, scratching the back of his head.
"Well, you're the fire guy. Make like a torch or something,"
Duke said, with a huffy tone of voice. Chesney rolled his eyes, crossed his arms, and said,
"I'm not going to call the fire spirits for something like that. And even if I wanted to, it would maybe last like a minute at best."
Sighing, he took a step forward.
"Maybe there's something near the door. Let's take a look."
Duke huffed, then turned away and started peering into the darkness at his feet. Chesney, instead, started trying to look at some of the details in the walls. He squinted and felt around. There were definite protrusions. "If I could just see a little bit." Just then, Chesney heard a click from behind, and the scene before him lit up in dim red lights. Stunned, Chesney whipped around and beheld Duke, hand near the wall at the other side of the door.
"What was that?"
Chesney asked, looking around the now visible interior of the tower. The walls seemed to be covered in tiny panels, some glassy with some sorts of devices behind them, and other panels that were opaque and seemed to be locked. The room inside the door seemed to be smaller than it would appear from the outside, and the room seemed almost bare other than a set of stairs in the center of the room, heading upwards.
I don't know. I tripped on something, and I caught myself on the wall, and then this happened?"
he said with obvious bewilderment in his voice. They both looked at the wall near him, and there was some kind of small lever or switch. There was some text, or symbols above it.
"The heck kind of writing is that? Do you recognize it?" "No, I don't have a clue,"
he replied, then said, looking rather puzzled.
"Aside from that, what did you trip on, though?"
There was absolutely nothing near the Sainel's feet, or anything at all on the floor. Duke looked down, then quickly spun in a circle and looked everywhere around him, also seeing nothing.
"But I know I felt something."
He looked back at Chesney with an annoyed expression.
"Ugh, whatever. Let's just keep going up."
Chesney agreed and walked towards the stairs. The stairs were steep, and beyond them he could see a room that looked virtually identical to this one, with the red lights and everything. They both ascended the stairs, with Chesney firmly in front at Duke's demand, of course, only to find another set right beside the landing, also going up. Just then, Chesney thought he saw something in the corner of his eye, but when he turned to look, there was nothing.
"Did you see that?"
he asked. When Duke shook his head, he thought to himself, "This lighting is terrible. I must be seeing things." The silence was still absolute and pervasive, and every step he took on the metal floor and stairs felt like a thunderclap that would send the roof above them crashing down. The loud crashing brought up the memories of his nightmares unbidden, and just to get the thoughts out of his head he struck up a conversation with Duke.
"Where did that key come from, anyway?"
he asked, turning to look back at Duke as they ascended the stairs.
"Key? Oh, the key. Right. Yes. Well, I just happened to be in Dakin's office, and then I just happened to look in his drawer, and there it was,"
he said, with a neutral expression on his face.
"Headmaster." Huh?
Duke replied again, missing a step and tripping a bit.
You called him Dacant. You should refer to his as the headmaster.
Chesney continued evenly. Duke looked totally confused for a moment, before his expression returned to a more familiar scornful one.
Oh, geez, you're such a sucker. A little goody two-shoes. Who even cares?
Duke replied, drawing out the words in a long, exasperated sigh. They continued on in silence for the next several floors of identical room. Just as they were about to start ascending another set of stairs, Duke blurted out,
"Shh! Did you hear that?"
They both froze completely still and listened to the silence. Chesney was expecting maybe footsteps to be stomping up after them, but he heard nothing. After almost a minute of nothing, Chesney was about to start walking again, when he heard it too. A rustle, or a flit, or flap in the air. Instantly, they both looked at each other in shock and terror, and then they frantically cast about the room for the source of the noise. The room was still empty, though, save for them. The thrill of being an explorer was just now beginning to wear thin. Chesney was seriously beginning to consider suggesting they just call it a day and head back down. But the thought of having to sincerely show he was scared to the annoying Duke was just too much to bear. Gritting his teeth, Chesney steeled his nerve and stomped up the stairs, with a surprised Duke jumping a bit from being startled by the noise and racing after. When they reached this landing, the red lights gave way to a mix of reds and blues. The walls had dim blue strips of straight lights, gently pulsing. The pattern drew the eye towards the central feature of the room, another door, set into a tall metal cylinder that extended from the floor to the ceiling. Beside it was an egg-shaped device, or maybe container, with a gently glowing green light right at the front. Almost without thinking, Chesney walked over and slowly pressed his fingers to the glowing light. With a grinding, whooshing noise, the egg-shaped container opened like an iris, revealing a dimly lit interior containing what looked like some kind of emergency kit, or the remnants of one. Inside, at the top, was bright red lettering of some unknown alphabet, and the contents of the container was some kind of foam padding leaving several empty hollows. One of the hollows was not empty, however, and contained a knife. The knife was quite small, and clearly intended for some kind of last resort, or as a general survival tool. Gingerly, he picked it up and measured the heft of it in his hands. It felt good, and pretty sturdy. The blade wasn't more than 4 inches long, by his eye. Smiling, he turned to Duke and said,
"Pretty sweet treasure. Hmm?"
Duke's eyes grew wide for a moment, but then he just scowled and said,
"Hey, that's not fair. I'm the whole reason you even got in here in the first place. I should have it."
Duke lunged for the knife, but Chesney spun out of reach and laughed. He teased. It felt good to get the annoying boy mad. At his next lunge, Duke managed to make the knife slip from Chesney's hand, and it clattered noisily to the floor. Instantly, the room was awash in moving shadows, flapping and buzzing. To their horror, the air above them was now filled with strange creatures darting about the room close to the ceiling.
"Heliopods!"
Duke yelled, as he crouched low to the ground and covered his head. That's exactly what they were. A whole swarm. Heliopods were small, verminous creatures about the size of a forearm that tended to live in attics and other rarely visited dark places. They were dark purple, which made them almost impossible to see even with good lights. They flew with 3 pairs of thin, buzzing wings, and their small thin body was connected to a large bulbous part at the bottom. Chesney could barely see them in the dim red and blue lights, and their shadows made it impossible to count how many there were. One of them flew near his head, and the large bulbous part at the bottom of its body opened to reveal a massive round mouth ringed with thin, needle-like teeth. Expecting to be bitten, Chesney at once collapsed to the floor and covered his head as well. Rather than swoop down and bite him, however, he saw it tense up, and then shoot some of the thin needle teeth right at him. 2 glanced off the floor, but 6 went deep into his arm in an arc. The heliopod swooped over him and buzzed closer to the ceiling and the mess of shadows above. He yelled out in surprise as much as pain, and he was shocked dumb for a moment, and all he could do was look at his arm wound. A few feet away, Duke was cowering and shaking in as small a bundle as he could manage. Between them, on the floor, was the knife. With shaking hands, Chesney reached his wounded arm out and grabbed firm hold of the handle of the knife. Even though it was a tiny, almost useless knife, the action served to focus him. They could deal with these vermin. They just had to try. Standing up, while holding his other arm up to protect his face, Chesney called out,
"Duke, get up. We have to scare them off or we'll be turned into pincushions."
He shuffled closer to Duke to cover him, and slashed into the air at the creatures, not really landing any hits, just keeping them at bay. From behind, he heard a screech before he felt another line of needles painfully punch into his back. Instead of crying out in pain, he growled and spun, flashing knife in the general direction of his attacker. To his shock, and partial involuntary revulsion, he felt the knife connect and slice deep into one of the heliopods, which buzzed back and away. The shrieking and flapping grew in intensity, and rather than be frightened off, the swarm seemed to become even more fierce.
"Duke, I need your help,"
he yelled to the Sano boy. Looking down, Chesney saw Duke was already shakily getting to his feet, and his face was contorted in rage.
"Filthy, disgusting vermin! You dare attack me? You'll all die for it!"
He shrieked in his fury and brought both his hands up to bear. In an instant there was a flash of something, and an arc of distortion shot through the air towards one of the creatures, and it was instantly rent completely in half, with both halves flying in different directions. Chesney was so shocked at the sudden display of violence that he watched completely frozen while Duke turned his head and growled out another curse before sending another wave of distortion to destroy a second heliopod.
"Use your magic, you idiot!"
Duke yelled, turning his head in Chesney's direction before focusing on the foes nearest to him. Shaking out of his confusion, Chesney turned away from Duke and tried to call forth the spirit. It was so loud and intense that it was making it incredibly hard to gain the necessary focus. He kept lunging at the flame, that feeling of warmth inside him, only for it to blow out each time. Finally, he let out an even breath, and slowly reached within himself once more and held out his focus for the warmth. He felt it build within him, and he thrust out his palm towards one of the creatures diving at Duke's back. A horrible shriek filled the room when it lit up as bright as day as a massive blast of flames erupted from Chesney's palm. The burst of flame engulfed the helipod, and it fell to the floor a black, charred heap. Duke whirled on him.
"Watch it, lame brain! You almost melted one of my fins off."
But apparently, that was enough. The bright light, or the mounting pile of dead, finally convinced the rest of the swarm to run off, and they quickly disappeared into a tiny, previously unseen crevasse in the ceiling. The danger passed, and the adrenaline starting to wear off, the two boys took deep gulping breaths and sat down.
"Sorry about that,"
Chesney panted after he caught his breath.
"It was gunning for you, so I had to think fast."
Duke just humped in response and started working on pulling all the little needle-sharp teeth from his body. Chesney began to do the same. His arm trembled involuntarily as he pulled them out, one by one. Most he could eventually pick out with just his fingers, but some were too deep to grab that way and he had to use his teeth. Slowly, a neat pile of the things lay beside each of them. They quickly came to realize that the ones on their back would be impossible to remove on their own, so they grudgingly took turns removing them for the other, with a bit less care and more yanking on both sides, of course. Finally, Chesney brought out his bottle of the fast-acting medicine and took one. Almost as soon as it touched his tongue, he could feel the soothing feeling of energy move through his body. He breathed a deep sigh of relief, and watched as the tiny pinpricks of bloody holes left behind started to close before his very eyes. He dispensed another of the pills and offered it to Duke. Duke spared a look at it, but shook his head, pulling out a bottle of his own and rattling it. It didn't look at all like the same medicine Chesney had, though he couldn't exactly read anything on it at this distance. Quickly, Duke popped a pill of his own and stashed the bottle away in a smooth motion. Their wounds tended to, they walked over to the door embedded in the tall metal cylinder.
What do you think this is? This can't be the top of the tower,
Chesney said, furrowing his brow.
Are you some kind of country bumpkin?
Duke said with an incredulous look on his face that just made Chesney think the boy's esteem for him couldn't get any lower.
Well, I just grew up in a small fishing village. Why?
Groaning, Duke gestured to the device.
It's an elevator. You climb in, and instead of having to walk up however many flights of stairs it is, it just, pulls you up. Seriously, how did you not know that? Well, excuse me, Mr. Know-It-All,
Chesney said under his breath. Aloud, he said,
Well, why the heck didn't the elevator start at the first floor then? Why start it here?
Duke pondered a moment while looking around.
I think that this part was maybe added on later. So, the building may have existed already, and I am guessing the stairs are a remnant of that.
Chesney shrugged.
Okay, what now?
Wordlessly, Duke leaned over and pressed a button to the side of the door, and with a whooshing sound, the metal doors slid away to reveal a tiny room with more buttons. He walked in, and Chesney followed. There were several buttons with strange glyphs next to them, but Duke seemed to have a general idea of what button to press, so he left Duke to it. When he did, the doors slid closed again, and with a jerk, Chesney could feel them start to ascend quickly. After just a moment, from seemingly everywhere, some music began to play. It was a strange song without any singing, and it didn't seem to go anywhere while never actually staying the same. Chesney found it both annoying and pleasant at the same time. Listening to it was somehow easier than trying to fill the silence with Duke by talking, though, before he knew it, the elevator slowed to a stop and the doors opened once again. If Chesney was impressed before by the strange design of the tower up to this point, he was completely gobsmacked by what he saw now. They walked out onto a metal platform suspended in the air over an almost limitless blackness. The dim, pulsing lights barely lit the way ahead to other sets of platforms held together by narrow catwalks. There were no railings, and Chesney was instantly filled with a sense of vertigo and almost wobbled off the platform before Duke caught his arm and pushed him upright again. Way out in the darkness were barely visible blinking lights and other structures that could only be seen by light reflecting off their shiny surfaces.
What is this place?
Chesney said in awe, slowly turning and looking all around him.
I think that this is what the Tower of Gabnid was built for. Whatever it is,
Duke said, also looking around and gawking. Something caught his eye, and he pointed off to the distance.
Hey, look there.
Chesney followed with his eyes, keeping a hand on Duke's shoulder so he wouldn't fall over again. Following the path of several catwalks and platforms, there was a bright, square light off in the distance. It was red, and slowly increasing, then decreasing in intensity.
Let's go check it out,
Duke exclaimed and ran off ahead, seemingly completely unafraid of the precarious footing.
Wait, don't leave me behind,
Chesney called after, but to no avail. He was left carefully picking his way across the thin metal paths to try to catch up to the boy by himself. Once again, he was filled with the feeling that this was a place better left undisturbed. But he would not be a coward. When he finally caught up, Chesney found that the glowing square was in fact two light sources, attached to some kind of pedestal. The top light was some kind of display, with blinking red text. Chesney couldn't read it, but it was something that was written over and over again. Below it was the slowly pulsing red light coming from a depression in the pedestal in the shape of a hand. Above the pedestal was more of that strange, crystalline metal that was all over the outside of the tower, all set into a twin set of something, two great wedges pointing directly at the pedestal. Duke smirked and raised an eyebrow.
I dare you to put your hand on it. Unless you're too scared, you little goobo cub. You stop calling me that right now, or I'll make you regret it, Duke.
Chesney snapped. Duke just pointed to the hand-shaped depression and sneered.
Make me then.
Incensed, Chesney impulsively slammed his hand down into it.
There. See?
He turned to look and see the look on Duke's face, but he was back to his self-satisfied sneer he always wore whenever he thought he was so clever. And that's when everything started to go terribly, terribly wrong. A voice came out from the pedestal in some strange language.
Gigana kolro iagnet, odo. Batha gentu tentian e quora. Zigidi iagnet namo ilriga. Gigana dal gran nata petri, stiln seta. Famigno desi, K mat.
Chesney jerked back, taking his hand off the pedestal just in time, as it began to spark and screech. A deep hum, or howl, began to quickly build in the air, and the entire tower seemed to tremble and shake beneath his feet. What was once nothing but darkness and tiny twinkling lights erupted into action and chaos. Sparks flew everywhere, and terrible grinding noises and the sound of long rusted metal being forced to move filled the air. The two great wedges above the pedestal lit up like lightning, and great arcs of electricity passed between them and other things far away from the platform. Then, some kind of ray, or light, or distortion formed between the two wedges, and enveloped Chesney. He threw up his hands to protect himself, but found that it wasn't painful at all. In fact, it didn't feel like anything, and after a few short seconds, it disappeared. But now, the Tower of Gabnid was utterly changed. What was once a dead, dark hall filled with dimly lit walkways was now transformed into a bright, churning mass of machines and unknown devices.
"This is,"
Duke began, looking all over within an expression something between awe and terror on his face. Then, he looked at Chesney, and his face went utterly pale. His mouth gaped in horror.
"No. Stay away. Help! Help!"
He screamed as he tripped over himself in his haste to run, barely scrambling to his feet as he ran away to the elevator.
"Wait! Don't leave without me!"
Chesney yelled, trying to chase after him but falling to his feet at another tremor. It was then that he felt it. In the tumult of the machines come to life, he could feel it. There was something here, not just him, or Duke, but a terrible presence he couldn't begin to describe. Chesney turned to look behind him, only to see something incomprehensible beyond the pedestal. In the air, a swirling form was taking shape. Eyes, teeth, arms, tongues, bones, wings, claws. A boiling mass of things bubbled into existence, grew, smashed into each other and merged, only to break apart into something else. A formless body of infinite form and flesh, incapable of description, expanded more and ever more. It grew to the size of a man, and soon a house. And then it grew further, and larger, until Chesney feared it would soon break apart the entire tower with its incredible size. But it wouldn't stop. Slowly, certain features would form and reform in the same places, becoming more and more solid. A creature was being born, with a long, bulky body, spikes, and teeth, and eyes full of malice. Chesney could feel the spirit in him cry out in utter terror at this being. He could feel, in the deepest parts of his soul, that this abomination was absolute, pure evil. Abruptly, the horrid growth ceased. Despite the terrible din of the machines in the tower, a disquieting silence filled his heart. The creature floated beside the platform, towering over the stunned student. Chesney needed to move. He needed to run, or fight, or cry. But he could not move. He could not breathe. He could only stare at the terrible thing, for what seemed like an eternity. The tension was broken when it opened its eyes and stared directly into Chesney's. He screamed then. One long, unbroken scream. He screamed until his voice cracked and all that came out was a hiss. The terrible being opened its mouth, and Chesney beheld then a mouth filled with brand-new razor-sharp teeth the size of trees, row upon row. A throat that could swallow a man whole. And from that throat emitted a deep, thunderous noise, growing louder and louder, and a light, intensifying, brighter and brighter from within that terrible maw. All at once, Chesney's world became nothing but the sound of an infinite, inextinguishable fire, and a terrible brightness that could not be blocked out no matter what he pressed against his eyes. There was no air left to scream with. There was only fire. Chesney gasped and sat bolt upright in bed. His nightclothes were sticky with sweat. It was another nightmare. Wait. But... no. Did that really happen? Breathing hard, Chesney looked and found himself not in his bed, but lying in the dirt. And his clothes weren't sticking with sweat, but with blood. And where his clothes weren't singed black, they were filled with holes with tender burns underneath. Where am I? What is happening? He tried to stand, but his body ached terribly, and he collapsed to the ground once again. His head throbbed, and every movement was agony. One of his legs, and some of his ribs felt like something were terribly wrong with them. His fingers trembling with pain, he reached for the bottle of medicine, and swallowed pill after pill until the torture abated into merely a solid ache. He was almost out, now. Getting back to his feet was painful still, but it didn't feel like he would break more by doing it. When he did, he finally turned to look at the scene he'd been dreading looking at since he regained consciousness. He stood beside the Tower of Gabnid, and it seemed completely untouched by the violence that took place within. The crystalline metal that made of the tallest portions was now glowing with its own light, in a dizzying, pulsing pattern. It was beautiful, but Chesney couldn't help but look upon the sight with anything except revulsion. The rest of the buildings on campus didn't fare nearly so well. Everywhere Chesney looked, his home was in flames. There wasn't a single wall that wasn't crushed. The air was filled with thick, black billowing smoke rising up into the dawn sky. Wait, dawn? It's the next day? Suddenly, panic set in.
Where's everyone? I have to find them.
Like a shot, he ran in the direction of the nearest crumbled structure. The building was completely demolished and caved in. It had been in flames, but most of those had died down. He crawled into the deepest crevasse he could reach and called out for anyone, but he heard no reply. He yelled again, and tried to pull up some of the masonry, but he heard nothing. Swallowing his feelings, he climbed off the wreckage, and ran to the next crumbled building. It seemed like every tree was burning or knocked down and uprooted and burning. All the manicured shapes were destroyed, every statue to the great one shattered. Parts of the ground were gouged deep as if from gigantic claws. It was then, as he was on his way to the main school and dorms, that he saw it. A tiny hand sticking out of a pile of masonry. Oh no. Oh God. Please no. He dashed over to it and started frantically pulling away bricks.
I'm right here. Hold on, I'll get you out,
he cried, through gasping sobs. He grabbed the hand to reassure them, only for it to easily come away from the rubble, attached only to the rest of the arm. It was stiff and cold. Startled, he dropped it and fell back on the ground. In terror, or shame, or both, he scrambled back from it, unwilling to accept the reality of what was going on. He scrambled to his feet, and ran, then, past more trees, more gouges in the dirt, more crumbled walls, more shapes on the ground he pretended weren't there. He didn't know where he was running, but he had to run away from this. This was impossible. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. Any moment, he knew, he would wake up in his own bed, and he would see his friends, eat the bad food, study for his exams, try and bring up the courage to talk to her. I need to wake up. I want to wake up. Please, he thought, desperately, with every fiber of his being. His feet kept dragging him forward, to the next stop on this terrible ride, the shattered statue, the next building, the next pyre, the next shape. Nothing was moving. Everything was smoke, and shadows, and flames. Everything was death. His feet stopped. Chesney closed his eyes. He refused to look. He fell to his knees and covered his eyes.
I won't look. It's not real. I won't look. It's not real,
he whispered to himself over and over. But he could still hear. The fire, the great inextinguishable fire that had burned him and tossed him from the tower. It was burning still. He covered his ears.
No. It's a nightmare. It's not real.
He screamed. He cried, but he still would not look. He sat there, refusing to accept what was in front of him for a long time. He cried until his voice became hoarse, until his tears stopped and had mixed with the soot of his face and dried. With the most bitter echo of his own thoughts, he told himself, "You're no coward, Chesney." He opened his eyes and looked upon what he had wrought. The great school of magic of Nasquat was completely engulfed in flames. Its walls were collapsed in on themselves. The fire burned high, and the great billows of smoke rose darkly into the air like a twisted twin of the Tower of Gabned. Everything was rubble and piles of ash. This place had seen the absolute worst of the devastation, as if it was a personal vendetta against its existence in the first place. It was then that Chesney heard something he never expected. Footsteps, coming behind him. Filled with sudden hope, he turned to see. It was Headmaster Dakin slowly shuffling in his direction from the gate. Any hope he felt was immediately destroyed when he looked into the haunted, empty eyes of his headmaster. The once kind face was now scoured into something between delirium and despair. Chesney tried to speak, but it was just a babble. Something to say, to try to explain, but what could he possibly say? It didn't matter. It didn't seem like the headmaster even heard him. Chesney fell silent, waiting for what the old man would say. Dakin just stood, watching the rising smoke and flames engulf the school, muttering to himself quietly. When his eyes turned down to Chesney on the ground, the muttering stopped.
They're all dead. Everyone is dead. Every single one. Nobody escaped. The school is no more.
He howled.
How could this have happened? The great Tower of Gabnid has been sealed for 10,000 years. What could have happened?
Dakin's eyes seemed to search Chesney's face and see something in his anguish. His eyes grew wild with rage. He yelled,
"It was you! Chesney, you broke the seal and awakened Dahlgren, didn't you? Didn't you?"
Chesney could only stammer incoherently between breaths and new sobs. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." He wanted to say, but the words died in his throat. The headmaster grabbed his own head and howled.
"The ancient machine Dahlgren has been released, and now it's only a matter of time until all of Linus is destroyed. It's the end. I'm so sorry, my ancestors. I've failed you. I've failed all of Linus."
Sharply, the headmaster rounded on Chesney and bellowed.
"You activated it. You broke the seal and activated Dahlgren. Now, you must go and stop it." "What?"
Chesney said, falling over backward, trying to back away from the crazed man. But the headmaster just pursued him, pointing a finger right in his face.
"Yes, you are responsible. You must go and stop this all before it's too late and the whole world is destroyed." But I'm just a kid,"
Chesney wailed.
"This is impossible for me. Why are you saying these horrible things?" "Enough,"
the man snapped. Chesney abruptly shut his mouth, and finally stood, shivering despite the terrible heat from the nearby flames.
"Go, Chesney. There is nothing left for you here."
With that, the headmaster shook his head, and the wild rage in his eyes gave way to that same hollow look of delirium and despair. He turned away and began to walk away deeper into the smoke engulfing the school grounds. Over and over, he muttered quietly,
"Linus is doomed. Oh, my ancestors, Linus is doomed,"
as he disappeared from view. Chesney watched him go, before looking back at the great pyre that engulfed the only life he knew. All his tears now spent, he whispered,
"I'm so sorry, everyone. I'm sorry, Tail. You were a better friend than I deserve. I'm sorry, Gite. You."
He choked for a moment, and continued,
"You deserve to see your mom again. And I'm sorry, Samza. You were right. Going to the tower was so stupid, and I knew it. I felt it the whole time, but I wanted to be special. Yeah."
He laughed bitterly.
"I'm pretty special, now."
Nothing left to say, he tightened the cloak around his shoulders, trying to hold closed the largest of the singed holes in the garment, and began walking. He walked through the rubble and flames, to the smashed gates. He didn't look back. He didn't deserve it. There was only this step, and the next step. And so, the 13-year-old student of magic, Chesney, walked a path following the destruction away from his home, the weight of the world on his shoulders.